Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name's Jeremy. I'm standing in for Alan Malloy tonight. He's off doing a meditation retreat up in Bendigo. He's doing a fasting retreat. We eat one meal on the first day and nothing on the second day, and then one meal on the next day. So he's probably thinking about pizza right about now. Next week you might want to ask him how he went with his retreat. So the topic that Alan chose for this month was looking at meditation practices that, particularly those that are useful for dealing with the kind of challenges that we've all been experiencing in the last 2 years over the COVID pandemic. And he mentioned, I think, the last few weeks particularly, things like loneliness and anxiety and depression. I think I'd add to that list probably frustration and boredom. Living with two teenage daughters, they've very much had to deal with lots of frustration and boredom. But you've probably got other things you'd add to that list, things that you've been dealing with, been facing and managing over the last 2 years. And also I think it's worthwhile to think about some of the benefits, some of the good things that have come out of the pandemic. Worthwhile to think about those too. So we'll do some meditation, and we'll talk about I'll talk fairly generally about some of the practices that we can use for dealing with these types of things. And then we'll be able to have discussion and question and answer. So firstly, I will start by doing some meditation. And so we'll do concentration meditation. And so meditation, as you probably know, it means focusing your mind on a mental object which is either neutral or positive. So that's what meditation is. And to do that, there's three main tools that we need to use, three main mental faculties. So these are translated in various ways, but firstly is mindfulness. And in this context, mindfulness refers to the mental faculty of remembering or holding in mind the chosen mental object. So we're going to meditate on the breath in a minute. So the chosen mental object is the breath. So remembering to keep that in mind is mindfulness in this context. So usually we find that our mind wanders off to other things, and so it's trying to remember that what I'm trying to focus on is my breath. So it's remembering, that's mindfulness. And then introspection is the second important or tool, faculty that we need to develop for meditation. And introspection, or sometimes called alertness, means observing your mind. So you're trying to focus on this object of meditation, and with introspection we're observing whether or not our mind has wandered off to other mental objects, has wandered off to other things. So that's just observing what's going on in your mind. So I think introspection or alertness, maybe both. So you're sort of alert to what's happening, but you're also observing what's happening, but at the same time you're keeping your mind on the object of meditation, so it's the breath. So it's a bit like when you're driving a car and you know that you have to keep your mind focused on driving, and then there's part of your mind which is watching to see whether you're focused or not. So when your mind starts to wander and gets distracted by something you're passing, there's part of your mind that says, hang on, keep your mind on the job, this is dangerous. So that's alertness, where you're observing what's going on with your mind and you bring it back to the task. So that's the second one. So firstly mindfulness, then introspection or alertness. And we'll use those, mostly those two, in this meditation we're about to do. And then third one is called conscientiousness. It's translated using various terms, but one term is conscientiousness. So that means that when some kind of disturbing mind, some disturbing state of mind comes up, for example, anger or strong attachment. So if you do a long meditation retreat, you might find that strong emotions can come up. You might remember something someone did to you 20 years ago and start feeling really angry about it. So then when a strong so-called afflictive emotion comes up and disturbs your mind, then conscientiousness is the practice of recognizing that and then applying what's called like an antidote or a remedial practice to pacify or subdue that afflictive emotion. Okay, so those are the three main tools that we need to firstly recognize in our mind and develop those faculties, and they're like our three best friends when it comes to training your mind and developing your mind, keeping your mind peaceful and positive. So we need these three tools. So our teacher here often says those are his three best friends because they always keep him happy. Alright, so I'll talk about those while we're meditating so they can become a bit more familiar. And then once we've developed some concentration, we can use that concentration to focus on a positive object. So the breath is a neutral object. We use it for developing concentration. Then when you've developed concentration using a neutral object, then you can use that concentration to focus on a positive object. So in this case we'll focus on the meditation, which is that all beings wish to be happy and to be free of suffering. So that's like I guess a basis for developing compassion. Anyway, we'll go through it and then you might have questions after that. So firstly, just sit in a posture or position which helps you to concentrate. So relaxed and comfortable but also alert. So usually that means having your back straight and your eyes mostly closed but a little bit open to let some light in so you don't get sleepy. So we're trying to avoid sleepiness and also distraction. They're the main two things we have to overcome when we're trying to develop concentration. And then just bring your attention to your body and relax. Make sure your body's relaxed. And then bring your attention to your mind and just let go of thinking about all the things that you've been concerned with throughout the day, all the things going on in your life, all the things going on in the world. Just let go of them for the next hour. Give yourself a break from thinking about all those things. And then just bring your attention to your breath and observe your breath moving in and out. If there's any particular emotion that's bothering you, like anxiety, or you can imagine that you're expelling that when you breathe out, or any tension or stress in your body, just imagine you're expelling that when you breathe out. Okay, so bring your focus particularly on the point just under the tip of your nose, on the breath moving in and out past that point. So we use mindfulness to keep that object of meditation in mind, which is the breath. So just recognize that faculty of mindfulness that's remembering what I'm doing now is focusing my mind on my breath. So that's mindfulness. And then alertness is checking to see whether your mind is staying there or not, or whether it's wandered away. And if it's wandered, then bringing it back to that object of meditation. Okay, so just count your breaths. It can be helpful to count your breaths. Just incrementally, so start with 1 and just keep counting upwards. And if you completely lose count, just start again, back to 1. It's a good way to check whether your mind has wandered off or not. Just check how your concentration is going, whether mindfulness is operating and keeping that object of meditation in mind, and also alertness. Check whether your mind has wandered off, and if it has, just bring it back to that object. So the whole concentration practice should be relaxed and gentle, and you shouldn't have to use a lot of force to try and pin your mind down. It's more like resting your mind gently on that object. And the idea is to keep your mind feeling very spacious, like the sky. So your mind is clear and spacious and relaxed, but also focused on the object and also alert to the mind wandering off. Again, check if mindfulness is remembering the object and keeping it in mind, and if alertness is watching the concentration and checking whether your mind has wandered or not. Okay, just for one more minute, and make a concerted effort to keep your mind focused. Okay, so now our mind has developed some degree of concentration. We can use that to focus on a positive object of meditation. So in this case, our object of meditation is the thought or attitude, thinking that all beings wish to be happy and to be free of suffering or problems. So starting with yourself, you think about how I, myself, are wishing to be happy and have had that wish for my whole life, even when I'm asleep, and also to be free of problems. So this is what it motivates me. And then in the same way as I have that wish all the time, so do all other beings, all other living beings, including animals. So you think about all the other beings in the world, starting with the people in your life you're close to, your family and friends, and the other people who live in this city and this country, and then all the other people in the world. So every single being has this fundamental wish, so we share that with them. That's our shared experience. So the purpose of this meditation is to generate a feeling of affinity or closeness with all other beings, to see them as being very similar to myself on this basic fundamental level. So even though they might seem strange, or their behaviour might seem inexplicable, they're still motivated by this wish. Okay, so we'll just end the meditation there. So any questions or comments about that meditation before we move on? You don't have to have any. I think, when we're talking or thinking about ways of dealing with problems like anxiety, the various things we've been having to deal with during the COVID pandemic, and things that we deal with in our life in general. So these three tools are vital. And you can see that if you can develop these tools and master them, then you can have control over your experience. So whatever you're experiencing moment by moment. So these are not just things we use in meditation, but the idea is we develop these faculties and use them in every moment of our life. And apparently you can even use them in your dreams when you become an adept meditator. So the idea is to take complete sort of control, I guess, over your experience in moment by moment, and choose what objects occupy your mind. So I think we have a tendency to think that we don't have a lot of control over what occupies our mind, that we're somehow controlled by external factors or external events. So the idea is to regain control of your experience using these tools. So then you have a choice as to whether external things affect you or not. So when something frightening is happening in the world, like the pandemic, or like a war, or like environmental destruction, so then we have a choice about how that affects us. And people might. I remember thinking that when one of my daughter's schools was saying that this pandemic is damaging mental health of the children, and I was thinking that seems too defeatist to me to talk about it like that. And it's actually would be better to focus on the fact that we do have a choice about how these external things affect us. So we have a choice as to whether we generate anxiety about things. And So it's sort of like not recognizing that we have that choice. And using these tools, we can choose in each moment, am I going to feel anxious about this, or can I remain calm in response to this external threat or problem, whatever it is. Do you agree with that? You don't have to. So feel free to disagree with anything I say. But it seems to me that we do have that choice. And you can see, I think, in your own experience. So, for example, if you're feeling anxiety about the pandemic, that the anxiety, I think, waxes and wanes. It's not there all the time. So then you need to think, so why does something like anxiety come up at some times and not others? So you notice that there's no sort of definite relationship between the external problem and the state of mind. So the anxiety is not there all the time. And there are, other threats in our life, other problems that we don't feel anxious about, that don't particularly bother us, but they might bother other people. So, for example, the road toll. I think in Australia, 1,100 people die each year from car accidents. But I think most of us don't sort of spend much time worrying about dying from the car accident. So my point here is just that we have this sort of choice over what bothers us and what doesn't. Things affect us differently. Anyway, that's something to think about. So the idea of these tools is to gain control over your experience. That's the idea. Okay, and I think as they become more familiar, then we can gain more control and then more power over what's happening in our mind. Okay, so this point that all beings wish to be happy and be free of suffering. So this is like, again, you don't have to agree with that. Yes, sure. Go on.
When you say free of suffering, free of problems,
yes.
That wouldn't be life, isn't it? Concentration I felt, would be more on the ability to deal with those problems and to have the strength to bear the suffering, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, if it's life, it's going to have problems and suffering. Otherwise, there will be something outside, I feel.
Yeah. So you're saying the problems are an integral part of our life? Yeah.
I think the concentration I feel should be more on the ability to be able to deal with those problems and to have the strength to deal with the suffering.
Yes, yeah.
I suppose that's where the choices come in that you were talking about.
Yeah, I agree. But wouldn't you say that when we're doing that, when these problems come up and we're using various ways of dealing with them, that what we're trying to achieve is to overcome the problems? So that's sort of our objective. Yeah, to sort of pacify it. Yeah.
The absence, I don't think, is going to happen in life, isn't it? If it's life, it's going to happen. That's what life is.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, it depends, I guess, on your worldview. From the Buddhist point of view, at least, in our current situation, which we call, in the Buddhist terminology, samsara, or cyclic existence. So problems are sort of inevitable, and as long as we have... But the idea is that even though they're there, there's things we can do about them, is the idea, yeah. 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 Yeah, so it's certainly not to deny that they're there. It's the idea is that you find out ways of, I think transforming them is a good word to use. So when a problem comes up, like a pandemic, is working out ways to turn this adverse situation into something useful. For example, developing resilience, Yeah. So this idea, anyway, is that this is like a basis for compassion. So recognizing this shared experience or shared status that we have. I think it overcomes this feeling of I being very different or separate to everyone else, which is a problem for us. And to overcome that by recognizing that everyone is sharing this experience of wanting to be happy and be free of suffering. So to develop that kind of close feeling, seeing yourself in others, and your shared experience with them. So that's the idea. So, given that this is what we're all trying to achieve, is to develop happiness, increase our happiness, and avoid problems. So then, how do we go about this? And there's generally two main approaches. So the materialistic approach is mostly looking at the outside world, looking at external things like friends or like possessions or sense objects. So trying to find happiness from external things. So that is generally referred to as the materialistic approach. And then the spiritual approach is to look at the mind and look at the source of happiness and problems within the mind. So from the spiritual point of view, the problem with the materialistic approach is that there's no definite connection between the external object and the mind. So you can think about your own experience with external objects, external things, so friends or possessions, and you think of things like fame and wealth and power. So there's a lot of evidence to show that these things there's no definite connection between having these things and feeling happiness. So people can have all these things, fame, wealth, power, beauty, etc., and still not feel happy. And we may have experienced that ourselves when there was something that we really wanted, whether it was a person or a possession, and then when we got that thing, that it didn't bring the happiness that we were expecting from it. And can anyone relate to that? Can you think of examples in your own life where you were disappointed with an external object that you thought was going to bring you a lot of happiness? Which is not to say that external things aren't important. I mean, we do need them. We do need friends, and we do need good conditions for our health. We need good food, and we need basic, shelter and comfort. But the point here is that these things are in themselves insufficient. That's the idea. And because there's no direct connection between having those things and feeling happy. That's the problem, according from the spiritual point of view, with material things. So there's not really a problem in having them, but there's no guarantee that having them is going to bring you the happiness that you want. And they're unreliable because you can have them and still feel unhappy. Sorry, say that again?
They also don't last.
They don't last. Good point. They're also important. They're impermanent. That's right.
The car will break in.
That's right. So if you're trying to get happiness from an external object, then there's always some anxiety there because you don't have control over it. So if it's a person, for example, and you think this person is the source of all my happiness, so it's a sort of inherently anxious situation because you can't really control that person. I mean, they could leave at any moment. They could pass away, they could die. So they're impermanent. So that's also a problem with seeking happiness. And a position of power, or I think, people who are very famous must, if being a celebrity must be quite an anxious experience, I think, because you could very quickly lose your celebrity status, by saying a wrong word or a bad photograph, or it could all disappear. So that's the problem with seeking happiness from external things. Okay, so then if we think about looking for happiness internally, so then how do we go about that? What is it that brings happiness internally? So the idea here is that there's certain states of mind that we need to develop that bring happiness, and certain states of mind that we need to let go of or minimize that cause us problems. So interestingly, the states of mind which cause happiness, so known in Buddhist terms as virtuous or positive states of mind. So these are ones that are closely or most accurately aligned with reality. So that's an interesting point. So you think about a state of mind, a so-called negative state of mind, one that's disturbing your mind, so like anger, for example. And the idea is here is that when you're angry with something, you're not actually seeing them realistically for how they truly are. So you're underestimating their good qualities. So the idea is if you could see them how they truly are, then you wouldn't feel angry with them. So I think that's quite a challenging idea. You think about some of the reasons, people that you get angry with and what they're doing that makes you angry. And think about what is it, what is your understanding of them, or is your, if your understanding was correct, would that pacify the anger? So the Buddhist idea is that if we could see all beings for how they truly are, then we would only feel love and compassion towards them. So it's the projections that we put on them that are stopping us from feeling love and compassion towards them. So you think about people that do really bad things, like Vladimir Putin comes to mind. So you think about someone who does something like decides that they want to invade a country, and then so how could you feel love and compassion towards someone who has such destructive wishes? And the idea is that their mind, you feel compassion for someone like that because their mind is being overwhelmed by these afflictive emotions. So, for example, it could be pride, or it could be strong attachment to an idea. So maybe he's strongly attached to the idea of the former glory of Russia, and so the idea is that someone would get to that state where they have those ideas of callously, harming thousands of other people, by their mind being overwhelmed by these afflictive emotions. And you can see that in your own experience, how your mind can be overwhelmed by an afflictive emotion like anger or jealousy or strong attachment, and you do things that you wouldn't normally do. So that's the idea of having compassion for people who have, strong afflictive states of mind. What do you think about that? Is that letting him off too lightly?
He's suffering.
You think he's suffering?
He's working on false information.
Mm.
As far as he concerned, if you really want to take his logic, then he's trying to help other people. People do with roses and
Yeah.
it's a different state
Well,
of mind.
I wonder, yeah.
But still, the idea that he's suffering and that's why he's doing what he's doing because of the suffering. If
Mm.
he was happy, he would not go to war.
Yeah, do you agree with that?
So he's not happy, so he's suffering. If you're not happy, that's when he's suffering.
Yeah, I think you can sort of verify that with your own experience, that when your mind is peaceful and happy, you don't have the wish to hurt people. You don't have the wish to take away their things, their country.
History is just a false event. My kids are not in this kind of exactly great, don't learn that anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the basis of compassion, is the idea of recognizing that firstly the beings, or everyone is wanting to be happy. Even Vladimir Putin wants to be happy and be free of suffering. But then these afflictive emotions overwhelm our minds and make us do stuff that harm others. And as you said, if our mind is happy, then we don't have these strong afflictions arising.
Isn't that why we have karma?
Why we have what, sorry?
Karma?
Karma.
He's going to pay in the next samsara. He's going to be born as a pig somewhere.
Yeah, so the Buddhist idea of karma is that when you harm someone, then you're going to experience harm in the future. So again, that's, from the Buddhist point of view, that's also a cause for compassion. So if someone harms others, and if they harm a lot of other people, then they're even more an object of compassion, because they're creating a huge amount of bad negative karma which will result in suffering for them in the future. So again, that's a cause for compassion. So I think the Buddha would say that a person like that deserves even more compassion, because they don't realize that they're creating all this suffering for themselves. But even if you don't accept the idea of karma, I think you can see how living a destructive life is a very unhappy state in comparison to living a peaceful life where you're friends with the whole world. Yeah, that's the idea of karma. Yeah, what goes around comes around. Yeah.
But how does that change anything? How does that change the third party?
So the third party, you're referring to like the Ukrainians in that example?
You're using the example of Putin. So
Yeah.
how does that? It's not going to change when he does the harm.
Our attitude towards him isn't going to change him. Is that what you're saying?
Yes,
Yeah.
but the issue still continues. And bring it into something more realistic. If it's somebody that in the family is antagonising you or upsetting you in a particular way,
Yeah.
by showing them compassion today,
Yeah.
and then tomorrow and the day after, but the issue is still there. How has that changed then?
It's a good question. So you think of someone who's harming you, like verbally or even physically. So normally our response to that would be to feel hurt, and then maybe to respond with anger and maybe harm them back. And so the idea with the practice of compassion is to see them as sort of like the victim, and seeing that they're somehow overwhelmed or afflicted by these states of mind, like anger or like attachment or jealousy or paranoia, So what we do have control over is our own response to that person. So as you say, we can't really control their actions, but we can control how they affect us and how we respond to them. So if someone says a harmful word to you, then you do have some choice over whether that word harms you, hurts you or not. You don't have to feel hurt by that. So in the practice of patience, for example, when someone says abusive words to you, you can transform that adverse situation into something positive by thinking, so I can use this verbal attack as a way of developing resilience for myself, keeping my mind calm, developing patience, developing mental strength. So this problematic situation can actually be something positive for me. And in that way you can keep your mind calm, so you don't react with harm. You don't feel hurt. You can keep your mind calm. And then you can respond in an appropriate way or a helpful way to that situation. Sorry, say that again? Yeah, that's right. So normally with anger we just exacerbate the problem and it escalates, and we're throwing rocks at each other. Sorry?
Break the cycle.
Break the cycle, yeah.
An eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, and we're all going around.
Yeah, so that's the idea. So can develop power over the situation by subduing or controlling our reaction, how we respond to it. What do you think of that? Does that sound like a reasonable approach?
It sounds unrealistic.
Why do you say that? Why do you think it's unrealistic?
Because if the person is controlled by, let's say, drugs or alcohol,
Yeah.
then they in fact themselves don't have any control over what it is that they do.
Yeah.
So by showing them compassion or by not responding to their aggression
Yeah.
and dealing with it in a calm and meaningful way, might be fine for that moment.
Yeah.
But then come tomorrow, when the same problem arises, then they've forgotten about yesterday because
Yeah.
they're now on to another drug or another alcohol or whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
I was going to ask like the same kind of question. How does punishment get punishment? Is it useful? Like if someone's done wrong?
So firstly, just on that point, so I think it's very important to clearly recognise what we do have control over and what we don't. So, as you say, we have little control over how people behave. Yeah. So if we recognise that, then that in itself can help a lot, because we think, okay, there's a certain amount I can do in this situation. For example, I can control how I respond to that person, but I can't actually stop them. I can't get into their mind and remove those afflictions. So that's helpful. I can do this, but apart from that, I can't do anything. So then you need to let go of that. So that in itself, I think, can be helpful, recognising what you can and can't do. And so what you can do, what we do have control over, is how their behaviour affects us. And by using these practices of mindfulness and introspection. So when the anger arises, you want to retaliate to their harm with your harm, so you can use practices to subdue that thought and say, that's not going to help. It's not going to help me, it's not going to help them. It'd be much better if I keep calm and I respond in a more helpful way, maybe buy them dinner, maybe walk away, or, just something that's not going to make it worse and hopefully make it better. So then in regards to punishment, so I guess the Buddhist view on punishment would be maybe sometimes punishment is helpful, like for example with children, if one child hits another one, then punishing them by scolding them using strong words and maybe scaring them a bit, maybe that can help.
I was just wondering that kind of sense of justice that people have, some wrongdoing, bad punishment, you have a sense of justice.
Yeah, I guess because the idea is basically everyone deserves compassion, like regardless of whether they're a mass murderer or they're a child, or regardless of who they are, everyone is equally deserving of compassion. That's kind of like the basic Buddhist idea. So then you might think, well, that's not fair, because some people are out there harming others, other people are trying to do the right thing, other people are suffering, so surely some people are more deserving of compassion than others. So the idea is that, as I was saying, because people who do harmful stuff are doing it because they're overwhelmed by these afflictive emotions, and if they had a choice between being a peaceful, kind, living a life of a peaceful, kind person, and then living a life as a harmful, angry, destructive person that doesn't have any friends. So if they could experience both of those, they would definitely choose the happy, peaceful one. So the idea is that they're overwhelmed by this affliction. They're not, it's not their true nature, is the idea.
So it's to really empower yourself when you confront the aggressor.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to put it, is to recognise that you do have some power in that situation, and particularly you have power over how it affects you. I was thinking of an example of a teacher here, Geshe Doga. He was in Tibet when it was invaded by the communist Chinese in 1959. Yeah, and so he had to flee, and his monastery was destroyed, and many of his family were killed. So it's similar to the situation in Ukraine, really. And but he actually recounts, because then he went to live in a refugee camp in India, and they were extremely poor, and many people died of starvation. And so extremely difficult time, he lost everything. But he said from a spiritual point of view, that was actually a very important and sort of important period of development for him, because he basically had to sort of let go of everything, of his whole sort of life, and focus only on his internal spiritual practice. So I think that's one example of how maybe a catastrophic situation can, for some, it's possible for some people to transform that into something positive, And I was thinking, like, when I was a kid with my grandparents' generation, people used to talk about how they lived through the Great Depression and, a decade of severe poverty. And people often say that generation had this sort of resilience after living through that those negative, bad experiences had helped them to develop this sort of resilience that they kept with them for the rest of their life. And also made them extremely frugal. Waste anything. So anyway, that's just examples of how negative external situations, circumstances, can be transformed by taking control over how we experience them, how it affects our mind. Do you agree with that? That's possible? And can you see how these tools are so important and useful for doing that? So we might have this external problem, for example, someone attacking us or abusing us. And so these thoughts of anger and hurt and outrage rise up. And then we can use mindfulness, so you think, okay, so what would be a better thing for me to focus my mind on at this point, rather than rage and vengeance? Is it possible to focus firstly maybe on a neutral object like the breath or something neutral? Just bring your mind to that. So using mindfulness, then you can keep your mind on that neutral object. So instead of getting caught up in rage and vengeance and hurt, etc., that your mind can focus on a neutral object. And then you use introspection, because your mind is going to keep wanting to jump back into revenge and anger and hurt and outrage. So you use introspection to maintain that mental object. And also then using conscientiousness to think about that person and how they're overwhelmed by afflictive emotions. Or to think about how this adverse situation can be transformed into something positive. So those are using those tools to take control of your, experience of that adverse circumstance. Do you think it's possible? I'm sure you've done it yourself in some situations. You've taken control of your experience of that adverse situation. And I think we have varying degrees of success, good days and bad days. So the idea is to make our minds familiar with these tools through practice. And then it comes to us more easily when we are faced with adverse situation. Yeah, sure.
I was actually in Tibet a couple of years ago, and I saw the monks. They were doing this very strange thing where they'd have one person sitting down like this, and they'd have another person standing over them and whacking their hands like this in front of them.
Yep.
I couldn't understand why they were doing it, but it was actually, and they continuously did it, like right up to their face.
Yeah.
To the point where they were intimidated.
Yeah.
Teaching monks to have this strength of mind. It's very hard to do.
Yeah, that's the debate practice. Like dialectics. In a large part of the monastic training is using dialectics, arguing back and forth. So one person takes one point of view and the other one takes the other. So the person sitting down is defending a point of view, and the person standing up is attacking their point of view. And so as I said before, I'm encouraging you to challenge anything that I say, and that's a big part of I think Buddhist tradition is the Buddha encouraged everyone to challenge his ideas. So that's what they're doing in those debate sessions. Is one person is sort of like the devil's advocate and disagreeing with the other person's view and trying to argue back and forth. So it's a really useful way of learning and of challenging ideas. So if I say something like, everyone deserves compassion because they're overwhelmed by afflictive emotions, then you can take the opposite view and say, no, that's just rubbish, letting them off too lightly, and they need to take responsibility for their state of mind. So then you can argue back and forth, which is try and find, which view you agree with. It's very useful.
The hard part is not to judge.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the idea is to not get too emotionally involved in taking either side. So you could swap and the next day argue the opposite. So it's trying to get this sort of universal, open-minded view of all different perspectives, and not getting attached to one particular view. Yeah, that's right. Not getting, this is my view and I'm going to defend it and everybody else is wrong. So letting go of that kind of attachment to ideas. Just one point I wanted to mention before we finish, which I think is a useful idea. So it's about maintaining mental health. And I think a useful analogy with maintaining mental health is that it's similar to the things that we do to maintain our physical health. So like with our physical health, in the same way there's certain things we need to adopt to have good physical health and things that we need to avoid. So in the same way, with our mental health, there's certain things we need to adopt, like focusing our mind on positive mental objects, and things that we need to let go of, like focusing our mind on disturbing mental objects like anxiety, like anger, like jealousy, like strong attachment. So you can see how there's that similarity. If we think of it like that, it can seem like a very practical thing to do. So I think that's a bit of a blind spot in our culture, where we spend a lot of time growing up, we're taught a lot about maintaining physical health, but not much about maintaining mental health. And there's very simple things that we can do to maintain our mental health, to keep our mind happy and resilient and not to get overwhelmed by negative emotions. And in the same way with physical health, with our mental health, it's something that we need to continuously work on and be mindful of all the time. So we should always be thinking about our state of mind, what our mind is doing, and then it's easier to catch your mind in the beginning before it goes into a spiral of rage and resentment, to sort of catch it early, think, okay, my mind is starting to go down that path. Or anxiety, you start thinking about all the things I've got to do, I've got to do this, I've got to do, oh my God, I haven't done that, and there's this thing coming up, and oh my God, this person's must be angry with me because I haven't done that. And then you sort of get into this spiral of anxiety and stress. So to sort of catch that early and just let go and say, okay, stressing about this is not going to help. It's much better to let go of that. So stress from the Buddhist point of view, I think it's useful to think, is described as just an overactive or overactive conceptualization. So that's an interesting diagnosis or description of stress or anxiety. So it's the idea is you're thinking of a threat and you keep bringing it up in your mind and worrying, feeling threatened by it. Keep bringing it in your mind, feeling threatened. So it actually serves no purpose for addressing the threat generally. It doesn't, most of the worrying that we do is not going to solve the problem. You think about worrying about the climate crisis. So is worrying about the climate crisis going to help at all? And I think the answer is maybe a little bit will motivate us, but a lot of the worrying that we do about it can actually be detrimental and stop us from taking action. So that's an important thing to think about. So we need to sort of take control of what's happening in our mind. Is this conceptualization, is this thinking about threats helping to solve the problem? Or is it actually making us less capable of solving the problem? So it would be better just to think about what you can do. Like I was saying, just what can I do about this problem? Focus on those things, and then after that, you don't need to think about it anymore. Just focus on what you can do, positive things. So stress is kind of like a bad mental habit. It's sort of a habit we get into. We just keep thinking about something over and over again, even though we know it's painful and it hurts, and we can see it's not really helping, but we get into this habit of going over and over. So you can see how mindfulness and alertness are very helpful in overcoming that habit. You catch your mind, I'm focusing on anxiety again. It's not helping. I just need to stop that and focus on something else that's positive. And as with physical health, it's habitual, so we can sort of train ourselves in developing these healthy mental health habits. For example, meditating. If you can focus your mind on a neutral object just for 10 minutes a day, I think you'll notice a big difference in your state of mind. So in the same way as we might try and walk 10,000 steps a day or something, is habit we get into, useful for the body, so we can develop positive mental health habits that keep our mind strong and healthy. And also people find a daily regime of practices as you do with physical health. Doing certain things at a certain time of the day, for example. So you can do the same with your mind. Take some time out to focus on calming your mind. So when you really focus your mind on your breath, for example, it's like a holiday. Because it's such a break from all this stuff that's going on in your mind all the time. If you can just stop that, just even for 10 minutes, it's such a holiday, such a break. And you feel that also affects your body. Your body's just like, oh, that's a relief. Yep. Okay, so on that note, we'll finish up. Thank you for listening. And Alan will be back next week. Thanks.